We are very happy to be joined here by Charlotte Clarke, who's the Executive Director of Common Ground Relief. Charlotte, thank you so much for sticking with us. We got a little backed up there due to some technical difficulties, but thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'm glad to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me on your show.
No, of course. The pleasure is all ours. Unfortunately, it has to be these sorts of situations. It seems that things are quite bleak, actually. I mean, it's sort of moved off the headlines, I think, in a lot of the national media, but it seems that, the power situation, the heat situation, there's so many things. Maybe let me not editorialize a little bit too much. What is the situation there on the ground currently in New Orleans and the area writ large? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. First of all, I want to pre-apologize since it seems like my internet's a little wonky, so hopefully we can stay online. But I would say that I'm based in New Orleans. Common Ground Relief is based in New Orleans. We're based in the lower 9th Ward. And right now, most of New Orleans proper has power back. Hey there, can you hear me?
Yep, got you.
Yeah. We can hear you clear. Don't worry.
Okay. Great. So 90% of New Orleans has power back as of yesterday. Really the last big swaths of outages came back online. But Common Ground Relief's work throughout the year is largely in wetlands restoration. And so most of the communities that we work with down bayou are in really dire situations and will be for quite a long time. My first job within New Orleans was with a residential construction nonprofit, and we were actually still doing residential construction work for pre-Katrina residents of the lower 9th Ward. So definitely through that work, I gained an understanding of just how long recovery can be in these situations, and definitely for communities down bayou and definitely for people who had damage to buildings within New Orleans, there's a really long road ahead. So we're really grateful within the city to be mostly out of that immediate need for cooling and food and water and shelter that was really acute this week. But that need continues to exist outside of New Orleans. And again, we're just trying to get tarps on folks' roofs right now. And I was talking to some relatives about it who weren't really familiar with disaster relief and didn't really even realize that this intermediary step exists of even just trying to make sure that your house doesn't get further damage by tarping it when there's, before you even get to fight with your insurance company and FEMA and get funding for long-term recovery. So we're really still in those initial stages, and efforts on the ground are really focused around just trying to get resources where they're needed most, and there's a ton of need. And the good news is there are a lot of people helping as well, but there's just a lot of need right now. So we're all working on trying to meet everybody's needs.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, these are natural events. To some degree, it is a natural disaster. But I feel, we often just sort of say that, oh, natural disaster, nothing you could do. It is what it is. I mean, from your point of view, both from a preparation standpoint and what we've seen afterwards, I mean, is part of the problem with why we see these recoveries taking so long is that there isn't really enough put in to help people on the front or the back end ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it mirrors the COVID pandemic in a lot of ways, where we absolutely have the resources and the knowledge and the expertise at our disposal to prevent a lot of the disasters that we see happening. And we choose to invest in systems that don't utilize those, those pathways. And so I want to shout out like Rise St. James as an example of a group that's doing really great on the ground organizing against Formosa chemical plant that is planned for St. James Parish. It's a historically black parish. They've gotten a lot of really great press around it and have been able to somewhat successfully push back against that project. But I think that, as well as our own work in coastal restoration, are examples of community groups on the ground really working to try and prevent the severity of some of these events and try to work against exacerbating the climate crisis. And yet we have people in power who aren't taking those same steps. So not only are community organizations and just individuals who engage in mutual aid and engage in activism and care for their communities like those are the people who are both working on preventing these sorts of crises from happening and also really the first to be responding on the ground. I think that the government's biggest failings are in exactly as you point out, leading up to these storms and not doing what is possible to prevent prevent the severity of these impacts. And so we can talk generally about the amount of oil and gas industry that there is in New Orleans and Louisiana at large. And also something that really stands out for me is specifically the grid has been a huge discussion. So there were 30,000 utility poles damaged in this storm. And this storm is coming on the heels of a 2-year-long effort for New Orleans to adopt a renewable portfolio standard. And so that was passed earlier this spring. But we ended up passing a version that was Entergy, really, which is our local utility company, put forth a lot of measures within this plan to continue to include nuclear as a part of clean energy. And then the timeline was there was sort of this choice between 2040 or 2050. So we ended up adapting a measure to go carbon neutral by 2050. And so a lot of people on the ground were pushing back and trying to make that a more aggressive timeline. And there were also components that could have been included in that portfolio standard to have community solar to basically disperse our energy generation, which would absolutely be possible in Louisiana with the resources that we have available in terms of solar energy, but also in terms of offshore wind. But our leadership is completely influenced by oil and gas corporations that are basically blocking us from, building out these incredibly useful measures for disasters that we know are going to happen and are going to continue to happen. Mm-hmm. So that's what I find to be most disappointing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I read this morning, amazingly, Entergy now trying to raise rates to pay for the repairs. And it's just like, wow, you guys got $10 billion in revenue, billions of dollars in profit, and somehow it's the people who are gonna be the most affected by your total lack of care now have to pay for the restoration. I mean, it really just feels from beginning to end, the burden is on the backs of those who suffer the most. I mean, I don't know what any Entergy executive is doing right now, but something tells me they're not somewhere in a shelter, worrying about what's going on. So, I mean, certainly if you want to speak to that, happy to hear you speak to it. But one thing I also just don't want to let go, talk a little bit, if you could, about the wetland restoration issue, because I don't think people know about the relationship between wetlands and these sorts of big natural disasters like hurricanes.
Yeah, absolutely. So Louisiana has been losing wetlands at a really rapid rate over the last 70 to 80 years. The average number that gets thrown out all the time is from a study that looked at wetlands loss between 1930 and about 2010, I believe. And that study found that we were losing an average of a football field per hour of wetlands. That number has since improved, largely due to the dual disasters of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and also the BP oil spill in 2010. And I think those brought a lot of national attention to the wetlands loss and how natural infrastructure is really important in our state, both for residents and also for, fishing industries and recreation and oil and gas as well. And so we have now, there was an Coastal Master Plan implemented in 2012. So there's been government investment in mitigating those losses. Also for a number of years, last hurricane season was very bad, but between that and the 2005, 2006 hurricane seasons, there was sort of a lull. And so hurricanes themselves actually can accelerate land loss as well. So there's a negative feedback cycle there. And the reason that wetlands are so important for mitigating storm impacts are dual. When you have trees and cypress swamp wetlands, you have wind speeds slowed down. And so having a healthy swamp will slow wind speeds up to 40%. And also having for every 4 miles of marsh wetlands that exist between us and the Gulf, we can reduce storm surge by 1 foot. So if you have 100 miles of healthy wetland between you and the Gulf, you can actually absorb a 20-foot storm surge. So this natural infrastructure is really important for many reasons, but definitely to mitigate storm impacts. And so the fact that oil and gas companies have basically been allowed to slice up our whole coast. And again, exactly as you point out, it's like people are profiting off of that. A few individuals are profiting off of that, and the rest of us are footing the bill. I won't get into this too much, but the industrial tax exemption program is also another way that the Louisiana state government rewards companies and corporations for exploiting our natural resources. And that tax exemption program basically means that Louisiana as a state and the people of Louisiana are not getting any benefit from that exploitation. That's just allowing a few individuals to make money. And a lot of people are really suffering from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings me to another issue that I've seen some discussion about, and especially with some of the communities you all are working with, more of a discussion like, well, you know what, we just got to get out of there. We got to move people out. We have to do this. And, and this is not to make light of the fact that some people are in very difficult situations, but reading some of the discussion about relocation, I can't help but get a little bit of a feeling that it's sort of like, well, maybe we could do something, but we rather not change anything that we're doing right now that's creating these problems. So let's just start moving people rather than address issues around climate change and other things like that. So I wonder some of your thoughts about that adaptation conversation vis-a-vis relocation especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest relocation conversations that's been happening has been around Isle de Jean Charles and the Biloxi Chitimacha tribe that lives there. And I think the conclusion after that long back and forth has basically been that relocation, even if you can win it, is not a real solution. It results in just total loss of community. And, even for, I think the relocation area that they were considering was about 100 miles inland, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a completely different ecosystem. And especially for Indigenous communities, when traditions are largely based on the local ecology and ways of, building housing and food systems from that local ecology, it can make a huge difference. And so I think that can be mirrored by like culture at large throughout Southeast Louisiana, whether folks are directly Indigenous or not. But yeah, it just doesn't feel like a real solution for complete loss of culture and community to be the price that we're paying for a handful of people who are in power to make money off of that destruction. And along with that, again, going back to Entergy and solutions that are being considered, they're looking at carbon capture and sequestration and things like that. And to me, we really need to be more expansive in our thinking, and like decolonization just needs to be a part of the solution to the climate crisis, because I think any further investment in systems that are like over monetizing our natural resources are just digging us further into the capitalist problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know a lot of people, they see these segments and they are talking about it on the internet. What can they do? How can they help? Where can people go to find out more about Common Ground Relief and most notably offer their assistance however they can?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find us at commongroundrelief.org. And we're also on Instagram and Facebook, very active under that name as well, Common Ground Relief. And I'd love to talk just a little bit more about our organization's background. We are a post-Katrina relief organization, and post-Katrina, we're very focused on disaster relief and then grew into wetlands restoration over the last decade. Again, because there's sort of this long-term view of how can we continue to mobilize volunteers to support our community through disasters like this. And so our main program, is that environmental program that runs year-round every year. And then recently we've due to Ida and due to the need in our community and in neighboring communities, we are orienting back towards disaster relief, and we'll continue all of those efforts. So right now we're redistributing resources throughout our community that are largely generously donated by individuals and by community members. So it's really quasi mutual aid efforts, and everything that people are able to give will really go a long way for us, and will go directly to communities that are most impacted by this disaster, and also through the lens of long-term recovery, and knowing that it's been 16 years since Katrina now, but there are still impacts that we can see today, and we expect similar things to happen with Ida, and we're here for the long haul. So we really appreciate anybody's ability to support us, either through sharing our message, through donating, and through volunteering as well. We'll be accepting volunteers for years to come. So yeah.
Right on. Well, I had the absolute pleasure of working with Common Ground Relief after Katrina, so I'm very appreciative of what you all are doing, what you've been able to do, and what you continue to do. And thank you so much, Charlotte, for giving us a little bit of your time here, sticking with us a little bit longer, and thanks for your work, and I hope everyone goes do something to support Common Ground Relief. But thanks again.
It's no problem at all. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.